There is a particular quality to the silence that exists at 5:20 inches the morning on a winter's day in southern Italy. The Strait of Messina lies flat and black between Sicily and the Italian mainland. The fishing boats are still tied to their moorings. The bread ovens in the old quarter have just been lit. The cathedral bells have not yet rung. Children are wrapped in blankets in rooms that still hold the warmth of the night before. And 200,000 people are asleep, entirely unaware that they are living the last 37 seconds of the world they have always known. The 28th of December 1908. That date sits in the historical record with the quiet authority of something catastrophic and irreversible. It does not announce itself. It simply marks the boundary between before and after, the precise moment when one of the oldest, most densely populated cities on the Mediterranean coast was struck so completely, so suddenly, and so absolutely that within the span of a single minute, it had effectively ceased to exist. The city of Messina had stood for over 2,500 years. Greeks had built here. Romans had conquered it. Normans had fortified it. The Spanish had left their Baroque architecture along the seafront promenade. Earthquakes had come before 1783, had been catastrophic, killing tens of thousands across Calabria, and the city had rebuilt. It always rebuilt. The people of the strait were stoic in the way that only those who have lived beside geological violence for generations can be. They knew the earth moved. They simply could not know that on this particular morning it would move in a way that no living person had ever witnessed and no record had ever fully captured. The fault system running beneath the Strait of Messina is one of the most complex and dangerous in all of Europe. It sits at the convergence point of the African and Eurasian tectonic plates, a zone of constant subterranean tension where pressure accumulates over decades, sometimes centuries, before releasing in a single violent exhalation. In the years leading up to 1908, seismologists, a relatively new discipline at the time, had documented minor tremors throughout the region with increasing frequency. A researcher named Mario Barata had published warnings about the seismic vulnerability of the strait as recently as 1901. The Italian government had received these reports. The reports were filed. The buildings of Messina were not designed to survive what was coming. Most of the residential structures were built from brick and mortar in the traditional fashion of the period: heavy, dense, and utterly rigid. Rigidity, in the language of earthquake engineering, is not a virtue. When the earth moves, a rigid structure does not flex. It fractures, and then it falls. In Messina in 1908, the structures fell inward, onto the people sleeping inside them, with no warning and almost no delay between the first tremor and total structural collapse. At 5:20 and 27 seconds in the morning, a rupture began approximately 15 kilometers beneath the surface of the Strait of Messina. The initial break was violent and directional, the seismic energy propagating upward and outward along the fault line in a specific pattern that would prove uniquely devastating for both Messina on the Sicilian side and Reggio Calabria on the Calabrian mainland simultaneously. Two cities, one fault, 37 seconds. The surface wave arrived in Messina with a deep, resonant vibration that survivors would later describe as something felt in the chest before it was heard at all. A low-frequency pressure that preceded the sound by a half-second, like the bow wave of an enormous ship passing underwater. And then the ground moved. It did not shake in the way that people who have experienced minor earthquakes might recognize: that brief, disorienting rattle, the dishes shifting on the shelf, the chandelier swinging and then settling. This was lateral displacement of the Earth's surface, a horizontal lurch of such magnitude that walls, which had stood for a century, moved sideways faster than a human being can react to stand up. The floors tilted, the ceilings came down, the staircases folded. And in the darkness of pre-dawn winter, in rooms where the only light was a dying candle or the faint gray glow of a window, 200,000 people had less than 4 seconds to understand what was happening to them before the decision was made for them by physics and stone. Within 30 seconds, 90% of the buildings in Messina had collapsed. Not damaged, not partially destroyed, collapsed. The ornate seafront palazzo that faced the strait gone. The post office building gone. The Court of Appeals gone. The hospital, which had been constructed specifically with reinforced design following the 1,783 earthquakes gone. The churches, whose thick walls and heavy bell towers had for centuries been the most solid structures in the city gone. The bell towers fell first, and they fell outward, crushing whatever lay beneath them in the streets. And then the water came. The seismic rupture beneath the strait had displaced a column of water that extended from the seafloor to the surface. The displacement generated a tsunami, not a single wave, but a series of them, the first arriving at the shattered Messina waterfront approximately 8 minutes after the initial earthquake. For those 8 minutes, the survivors who had pulled themselves from the rubble, who had staggered out of collapsed doorways into a city that no longer existed, who were standing in the pre-dawn darkness, surrounded by the sounds of settling masonry and the cries of the trapped, those survivors watched the sea. The sea had done something wrong. Everyone who saw it would say that afterward, in the weeks of testimony that Italian investigators gathered. The water had pulled back from the shore, first retreated 50 meters, 100 meters, leaving the harbor floor exposed, the boats resting on wet sand in the darkness. It was a sight that the fishermen among the survivors understood instinctively, and those few who understood it ran. The first wave struck the Messina waterfront with a recorded height of between 1.5 and 2 meters, enough to sweep through streets already piled with rubble, enough to reach into the ground floors of the buildings that had somehow partially survived the earthquake, enough to carry with it every loose object the earthquake had deposited across the harbor district, and weaponize it into moving water. The second wave was slightly larger. The third receded more slowly than the others. The strait, for the next 4 hours, continued to surge and withdraw in a pattern that made it impossible to reach the waterfront safely from either side. On the Calabrian side, Reggio Calabria had experienced the same earthquake within the same 37 seconds. The destruction there was equally catastrophic, between 5,000 and 15,000 dead in Reggio alone, the precise number impossible to establish because the administrative systems that would have recorded such information had themselves been destroyed. The regional prefect's office was rubble. The local police headquarters was rubble. The telegraph lines, both the overland cables and the submarine cable crossing the strait, were severed within the first minute, cut either by the ground movement itself or by the tsunami's effect on the underwater infrastructure. Messina and Reggio Calabria, two cities totaling approximately 250,000 inhabitants, were simultaneously cut off from the rest of the world. They thought the worst was over, but the true nightmare was just beginning. Rome did not know. Not immediately. Not for hours. The severed telegraph cables meant that the first news of the disaster reached the Italian mainland by the most primitive possible method, a survivor who had access to a working boat, who navigated across a churning, debris-filled strait under a winter sky, and who eventually reached a point from which a working telegraph line could be found. The first confirmed report of the disaster reached Rome at approximately 9:00 inches the morning, more than 3.5 hours after the earthquake had struck. By 9:00 inches the morning, tens of thousands of people had already been trapped beneath rubble for 3.5 hours. The temperature on the morning of the 28th of December 1908 hovered just above 5 degrees Celsius. The injured who were conscious were already in the early stages of hypothermic shock. The trapped who were uninjured were beginning to exhaust the air pockets within which they had survived. And across the strait, an estimated 40 to 50,000 people who had survived the initial collapse and the tsunami were now wandering through a city that had no food, no clean water, no medical facilities, no functioning government, and no shelter, because the shelter had fallen on them. The Italian government's response, measured in the cold forensic language of disaster management, was slow. Prime Minister Giovanni Giolitti received the initial reports and immediately dispatched what resources were available, but the resources that were available in 1908 were limited in ways that are difficult to appreciate from a modern perspective. There were no helicopters. There was no rapid deployment military rescue infrastructure of the kind that would be developed after the Second World War. The Italian army had soldiers, and those soldiers could dig. But getting them to Messina required rail transport, and the rail lines serving the Sicilian coast had been damaged. Getting them to Reggio Calabria was marginally more straightforward, but the Calabrian road infrastructure was itself a product of the same neglected southern Italian development policy that had left the buildings of Messina unreinforced for over a century. What arrived first was not the Italian government. What arrived first was the Russian Imperial Navy. The Russian training squadron, consisting of the armored cruiser Admiral Makarov, the cruiser Bogatyr, and the cruiser Slava, had been conducting maneuvers in the western Mediterranean. On the morning of December 28th, the squadron was anchored at Augusta, on the eastern coast of Sicily, approximately 100 kilometers south of Messina. The Russian sailors felt the earthquake. They saw, on the northern horizon, a column of smoke and dust rising above where Messina should have been. The squadron commander, Rear Admiral Litvinov, ordered immediate departure without waiting for orders from St. Petersburg, without waiting for diplomatic clearance, without waiting for the Italian government to formally request international assistance. He pointed his ships north and made for the strait at maximum speed. The Russian sailors arrived at the Messina waterfront in the mid-morning of December 28th before any organized Italian rescue presence had reached the site. What they found, as described in the subsequent official report filed by Admiral Litvinov and later entered into the Russian Imperial Naval Archives, was a city that had been compressed downward into its own foundations. The seafront promenade, which had been one of the most celebrated urban boulevards in southern Italy, was a field of broken stone, interrupted by sections of decorative iron fencing bent at impossible angles. The sailors waded through water that still covered the lower streets. They began pulling at rubble with their hands, with boat hooks, with whatever tools the ship's stores contained. They worked without translators, without maps of the city's street plan, without any systematic knowledge of where the buildings had been or where the population was most densely concentrated. They worked by sound, moving toward the sounds of voices beneath the stone. Survivor accounts later collected by Italian investigators noted the particular surreality of the moment when Russian sailors in Imperial Navy uniforms appeared from the direction of the harbor. One survivor, a schoolteacher named Concetta Marchesi, whose account was preserved in the municipal records reconstruction efforts of the following years, described seeing men in dark naval uniforms moving through the dust with a focused, systematic urgency that she had not expected from strangers, men who did not speak her language reaching into rubble and pulling out children they had never seen before. The British Royal Navy arrived shortly after. HMS Minerva and HMS Sutlej, both dispatched from Malta, reached the strait by the afternoon of December 28th. The British sailors brought medical supplies and organized a field hospital operation on the waterfront, using the ships themselves as treatment facilities for the injured who were too severely hurt to be moved further. The logistical competence of the British Naval Medical Operation Triage Systems, organized stretcher teams, the systematic prioritization of cases stood in stark relief against the background of a city that had lost every functional institution it possessed. The fires had started within hours of the collapse. Gas lines, fractured by the earthquake, leaked into spaces where cooking fires had been burning at the moment of the collapse. The fires spread through the rubble in a slow, grinding way that was different from a structural fire. In an intact building, they moved through voids in the debris, emerged at unexpected points, and were extinguishable only by finding the source, which required physically moving the rubble that was covering the gas main, which required not disturbing the rubble that was currently supporting the trapped survivors above the gas main. For 4 days after the earthquake, fires continued to burn in sections of the old city. The smell of burning wood, fabric, the contents of bakeries and wine cellars, mixed with the stone dust that hung in the winter air above Messina in a haze that survivors said turned the afternoon light the color of weak tea. The Italian government, once mobilized, did act with the authority and scale that the disaster demanded. King Vittorio Emanuele III himself traveled to Messina aboard a naval vessel and arrived on December 30th, 2 days after the earthquake. He walked through the rubble fields personally, which was noted extensively in the Italian press and was significant as a symbolic act of national solidarity. The practical rescue and relief operation that followed his arrival was large-scale and ultimately effective in the medium-term sense of establishing order, preventing epidemic disease, and beginning the removal of debris. But in the critical first 72 hours, the window during which trapped survivors have the highest probability of being found alive, the organized Italian response was largely absent. The people who were pulled from the rubble in those first 3 days were pulled out primarily by Russian and British sailors, by surviving Messina residents digging with their own hands, and by a small number of Italian soldiers who had reached the city by improvised means before the organized military columns arrived. The final confirmed death toll from the Messina earthquake and tsunami of 1,908 stands at 75,000 to 82,000 dead in Messina alone, with an additional 5,000 to 15,000 dead in Reggio Calabria and the surrounding Calabrian towns. Combined estimates range from 80,000 to as high as 200,000 when accounting for rural villages in the surrounding provinces where record-keeping was destroyed along with the villages themselves. The Istituto Nazionale di Geofisica has recorded the earthquake's magnitude as 7.1 on the moment magnitude scale, making it the strongest earthquake ever recorded in European history. These numbers are not abstractions. Each one represents a person who was alive at 5:19 inches the morning and was not alive at 5:21. The arithmetic of that fact is simple. The weight of it is not. Among the approximately 200,000 people who had been in Messina before the earthquake, roughly half are estimated to have survived the initial collapse and tsunami. Of those survivors, thousands more died in the days and weeks that followed, from crush injuries, from hypothermia, from infections in an environment without functioning sanitation, from the secondary effects of living in the open during a Sicilian winter without shelter or food. The United States government, under President Theodore Roosevelt, dispatched naval vessels with supplies. The Russian Tsar sent formal condolences and emergency aid. Donations arrived from across Europe and North America. The city of New York organized a relief fund. The mechanisms of international humanitarian response in 1908 were slower and less systematic than anything that would exist today, but they functioned, and they were often faster than the mechanisms of the Italian state itself. The social landscape of Messina in the days after the earthquake became something that later historians and sociologists would study with particular attention, because it revealed the precise architecture of what happens to human society when every institution that normally structures it is removed simultaneously. The courts were gone. The police headquarters was gone. The prison had collapsed, releasing its inmates into the rubble, some of whom joined the rescue efforts, some of whom did not. The banks had collapsed, making currency simultaneously both the only thing that could buy food brought in by boat and entirely inaccessible since no one could reach the vaults. The church hierarchy had lost most of its local representatives. The Archbishop of Messina died in the collapse of the Archbishop's palace. And in this institutional void, something happened that Italian investigators documented with careful and uncomfortable precision: looting. The looting of Messina in the days after the earthquake was extensive, systematic, and not limited to the dispossessed. Italian army units that arrived in the first days reported encountering individuals removing valuables from collapsed buildings, jewelry, cash, silverware in operations that had the organized character of deliberate salvage rather than the opportunistic character of emergency theft. The Italian government's response was rapid and severe. A state of siege was declared over Messina on December 30th, giving military authorities summary powers. Several individuals were executed by firing squad for looting in the days immediately following the declaration. The executions were carried out publicly and were reported in the Italian press as a necessary measure. Whether they were necessary or whether they represented the imposition of a brutal order upon people who were themselves survivors of the same catastrophe is a question that Italian historians have continued to debate for over a century. The king's presence and the subsequent intense Italian government focus on Messina as a symbol of national tragedy and national recovery also carried an undertone of political sensitivity that was not incidental. Southern Italy, Sicily, and Calabria, specifically, had been a source of chronic political concern for the unified Italian state since the Risorgimento of the 1860s. The South was poorer, less developed, and systematically underinvested in compared to the industrial North. The Messina earthquake made the consequences of that underinvestment impossible to ignore. The buildings that collapsed in Messina were buildings that had not been reinforced because the government had not required them to be reinforced and had not allocated the resources to make reinforcement economically feasible for the building owners. Mario Barada's 1,901 report on seismic risk in the Strait had identified exactly this vulnerability. The report had been filed, and this is the sentence that sits at the center of the Messina disaster, quietly and permanently. The report had been filed. It is not a sentence that accuses any individual of deliberate malice. It is a sentence that describes a system in which scientific knowledge about mortal risk existed, was communicated to authority, was acknowledged, and was then absorbed into the bureaucratic structure and rendered inert. The earthquake of 1,908 did not kill 80,000 people because the science was unknown. It killed 80,000 people because the science was known, and the cost of acting on it was judged, implicitly, to exceed the political will available to act. The buildings were not reinforced. The evacuation plans did not exist. The early warning infrastructure was not built. And so, when the fault beneath the strait finally released the pressure that had been accumulating since the last great rupture, the city above it had no more ability to survive it than it would have had in the Roman period. The reconstruction of Messina began almost immediately and continued for decades. The Italian government committed significant resources to the rebuilt city. New building codes were introduced following the earthquake, including some of the first seismic-resistant construction requirements in Italian legal history. The new Messina that rose from the rubble was lower, more regular, built with wider streets, specifically to allow debris clearance in the event of future collapses, and constructed to specifications that, while not up to modern earthquake engineering standards, represented a genuine departure from the pre-1908 approach of building, as if the ground beneath would remain still. But the rebuilt Messina was also, in some fundamental sense, a different city, not just physically. The social fabric, the dense network of family relationships, neighborhood associations, guild structures, and civic traditions that had characterized Messina for centuries had been severed. Tens of thousands of Messinese had lost not just their homes but their entire extended families. The city that was rebuilt was populated significantly by people who had come from elsewhere, by reconstruction workers who stayed, by survivors whose relationship to the new streets and new buildings was mediated always by the knowledge of what lay beneath them. A 2008 study conducted by the University of Messina in connection with the earthquake's centenary found that virtually every established Messina family could trace specific ancestral losses to December 28, 1908. The earthquake had not just damaged the city, it had amputated a generation. The international dimension of the disaster's aftermath also left lasting marks. The Russian sailors of the Imperial Training Squadron received the Italian Medal for Civil Valor the first time that decoration had been awarded to a foreign military unit. The relationship between Italy and Russia in the years immediately following 1908 carried a warmth that historians have attributed, at least partially, to the memory of those sailors wading through the rubble of the Messina waterfront. King Vittorio Emanuele III personally sent a letter of gratitude to Tsar Nicholas II that acknowledged, without diplomatic evasion, that the Russian Navy had reached his subjects before his own government had. That letter, preserved in the Russian Imperial Archives, is notable for its directness. It does not soften the admission it contains. And in 1914, when the world reorganized itself along lines that would eventually make Russia and Italy combatants on opposite sides of a global conflict, that letter continued to exist in the archive, a document of a moment when two empires, briefly and practically, had simply been neighbors, helping neighbors clear rubble. The scientific understanding of what happened beneath the Strait of Messina on the 28th of December, 1908, has become more precise in the century since the event. Seismological analysis of the historical records, combined with more recent GPS measurement of fault movement in the strait, has confirmed that the 1908 earthquake involved the rupture of a normal fault running along the eastern margin of the Messina Graben, a geological depression on the floor of the strait. The rupture propagated from south to north over approximately 30 seconds, generating the asymmetric pattern of destruction that devastated both cities simultaneously, while sparing some areas of higher elevation in the surrounding hills. The tsunami was generated by the vertical displacement of the seafloor along the fault, with the maximum wave height occurring at the Messina waterfront, due to the specific geometry of the harbor bay and the shallow water approach. Modern seismologists who have studied the Messina fault system have been consistent in their assessment that the conditions that produced the 1908 earthquake, the accumulated tectonic stress along the Messina Graben fault, have been regenerating since the rupture was released. The question of when the next major earthquake will strike the strait is not a question of whether, but of when, and of what will be above it when it comes. The current population of Greater Messina is approximately 240,000 people. The building stock of the city includes structures from the post-1908 Reconstruction period buildings that were built to the seismic standards of 1909, which were better than those of 1908, but which are now over a century old and have not been systematically retrofitted to contemporary earthquake-resistant standards. A 2012 assessment by the Italian National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology identified the Messina Strait as one of the highest-risk seismic zones in Europe and noted that the gap between the region's assessed risk level and the resources devoted to seismic preparedness remained significant. The report was published. It was acknowledged. It was filed. There is a photograph taken in the days after the December 28th earthquake that appears in most serious historical treatments of the Messina disaster. It shows the seafront promenade, or rather, it shows the space where the seafront promenade was. The ornate buildings that had lined it are gone. In their place is a field of rubble that extends to the water's edge. In the middle distance, two figures can be seen moving through the debris. They are small against the scale of the destruction surrounding them. The photograph was taken from a position slightly elevated above street level, which means the photographer had climbed something, perhaps a section of wall that was still standing, perhaps the rubble itself, to get the composition. The sky above the ruins is overcast. The water of the strait is visible in the background, flat and indifferent. The two figures in the middle distance are moving toward something, or they are moving away from something. From this distance, at this resolution, in this light, it is impossible to know which, but they are moving. And that, in the end, is the thing that the Messina earthquake of 1908 records most permanently about the human beings who lived through it, not the number of dead, not the political failures, not the diplomatic correspondence, not the seismological data, but the image of people who had survived something unsurvivable, standing in the rubble of everything they had known, and moving, somewhere, somehow, forward. The Strait of Messina today is calm. The ferries cross it every 30 minutes, carrying cars and trucks between Sicily and the Italian mainland. Tourists photograph the view. The rebuilt city behind the waterfront has cafes and hotels, and a university. Children walk to school on streets that have names, streets that are built on top of streets that no longer exist, streets whose original stones are buried 6 meters below the current pavement level, under the rubble of the December morning when the earth decided, in 37 seconds, that it was time to begin again. The fault is still there. It has been there for 5 million years. It will be there long after the cafes and the ferries and the university and every name on every street sign have been forgotten. And somewhere in an archive in Rome, and in an archive in Moscow, and in the institutional memory of every seismological institution that has ever studied this particular corner of the European continent, there are reports, detailed reports, accurate reports, reports that describe, with considerable precision, what will happen when the fault moves again. Whether those reports will still be filed when that moment comes, that question does not belong to the earthquake. It belongs to us.